Hello, in this iteration we'll focus on displaying a list of contacts. This would be a little bit longer iteration because we're going to set up the data model as well as learn about displaying data in the table view controller. So here is our iteration plan. We finished planning for the project and setting up the project in Xcode, and now we're ready to think about what we need to do to display a list of contacts. So we follow the process: problem formulation, solution implementation. The scope is to, in the problem formulation, we focus on the scope. So we want the user to open the app and see a list of sample contacts to be displayed. How are we going to test it? We want to put a sample contact, John Doe, or if you look at your address book when you buy a new phone, they will have like maybe your carrier's contact information, customer service, the manufacturer contact information. So there are some sample or example contacts already built in. So we want to build in some samples and then the user can add to it. In solution formulation, we follow the model view controller design pattern. In the model, we want to display the list of contacts. So the first item in the model is the list of contacts. In iteration 1, we introduced the NS mutable array as a library collection object that can help us manage a dynamic list. Dynamic list meaning a list that we don't know how big it is. Contrary to the previous projects where we used NS array, we knew at the time of creating the array how many items will be in it, whether we loaded them from a file or loaded them from the MP3 collections. We know what the size is, but in an address book we're gonna provide the user with an ability to add to the list. So some users may have 10 items, some users may have 1,000 items. Since we don't know the size, the NS mutable array gives us a collection mechanism that is elastic. It can change the size based on the what the user adds to it. So that's the first data type we need to use. The second one is the contact. And the contact has multiple data items as we discussed in iteration 1. It has a first name, a last name, and an email address. And it can have more. You can add more to it if you would like. All of these together, the first name by itself represent a string. It's a text. So you can use the string type, but the first name by itself is not a data concept for our problem. Our problem, the data in our problem, the data concept is the contact, and the contact encapsulates those other data items inside of it. And that's why we started to think about using a custom type, because now we have a situation where the data we need in our application is composed of other data items as well. And we do not have a library that encapsulates all of those into one data item like we do with other things. So here we're going to create our own custom library, custom type, and include that. So how do we create a custom type? We create our own class. So a class is a unit of software. We've used a class before as to represent the controller, the custom controller, which is a type, but we have not used that type ourselves. The operating system uses it as it launches our application and attach or connect our controller to the screen and calls on the different attributes and the different functions that we create inside our controller. So here we're going to be doing all of this ourselves now. So the class is a unit of software. It starts with the keyword class and it has a body in it. In the most primitive form, a class needs a name, and that's it, and a body. And you can have an empty class, as we will see when we go into implementing this. An instance of a class, when you initialize a class, you are creating an instance, and an instance of a class is called an object or a variable. So if you recall, we have used the string class multiple times. The string is a class, but we did not create that class. It come to us in the library. But if you look at its definition, it's a class called a string. And then when we use the class string by saying var message equal or var message a string type, we are creating an instance of a string. And that instance, we call it an object or we call it a variable. A class includes two things: data items or functions. The data items, we call them the instance variables or variables that have the class scope. We also call them attributes. We can also call them properties. The functions, we also call them behaviors or tasks, the things that the class can do. The data are the things that describe the class. The functions are the things that the class can do. You can represent a class with this diagram. On the top, you see the name of the class. In the next section, you list the attributes, the name that you want to use for the attribute, and the type. And in the following section, you represent the functions in the class and whatever parameters or return value these functions will take. So from this diagram, we are after creating a class called Contact. And this class Contact will have three attributes or three data items. One to represent the first name, and the type will be string. The other for last name, the type will be a string. The third is for email address, and the type is a string as well. And this class will have only one function, and that function is to initialize the contact. You can have multiple ways of initializing a contact. What you see in front of you is a default initializer, meaning that you do not provide the class with any values to initialize, so the class will just use some default values. You can add other functions, as you will see later on, but this is just our second iteration. In the view, we're going to use the UI table view controller, and we have done that in the project setup and added a UI table view controller, although we did not discuss much about it. In the overview, if you go to the Apple developer website and search for table view controller guide, you will see a nice guide that gives you explanation about the table view controller. If you are taking the class here at the university, you will see in the toolbox section there's a link to the table view controller guide from the Apple developer site. And a table view controller is a controller, and inside the controller there's a view, which is very similar to what we used in the past, a controller and then a view. But this view is a table view, so it's made out of cells. And the table view can have as many cells as you want. It can also be organized in sections. So to create a table view, you want to know how many sections in it, how many rows, and what the cell on each row should look like. And we will go through that as we build the table view controller. In a sense, if you, I don't know if you started to notice, in module number 3, when we did the unit converter, we used a library or a component called UI picker view, and the picker view was the wheel, and in the wheel we had to say how many categories in it, which is kind of similar to sections, which how many wheels, and then for each wheel how many rows we want to have, and for each row do we want to put a title or do we want to put a view. A table is very similar, except that the rows are displayed as a list, not as a wheel, and it takes the full screen size, the full view. But in the picker view, to create the picker view, we had to have a data source and a delegate. For a table view, you want to also have a data source and a delegate. By default, when you add a table view controller, the controller is connected with the table view as its data source and as its delegate. And we will see that, and if you looked at the class that the Swift class that we added, the template from the Xcode adds those functions for us automatically. But we need to figure out a way to determine how many rows we need in the table view controller and format the cell for each one of those rows. In order to manage the source, we said we need a contact, but then the data model here is a list of contacts, not just one contact. So how are we going to represent that mutable array? We have two ways. We can have inside the table view controller manage both the table view controller as well as managing the list of contacts, or we can separate the responsibilities and retain one single responsibility per class. So if the table view controller job is to manage the table view, then we need to add another class to manage the collection of contacts. So I'll introduce here that we're going to create another class for the data, and I'm going to call it the contacts data source. And that class will serve as a data source for or as the data source for the table view controller. I can connect the table view to this class directly as its data source. In this case, I need to implement protocols like we learned in module 3. I'm not going to get ourselves into that, so I'm just going to create an instance of the contact data source inside the table view controller. This contact data source will have one responsibility, which is managing the list of contacts. So one data item or one attribute, which is the contacts and the type as we described, NS mutable array. And then it will have multiple functions. First, the table view controller need to know how many rows. So it needs to provide the number of the count of contacts, and it needs to provide that as a return type of integer. The table view controller also needs to form the cell for each row, and I'm going to put the last name and the first name in the cell. So I need to provide back the contact at index. Then for later iteration, we need to be able to add a contact to the list. And then for the extra credit, we need to be able to delete a contact, move a contact, and then in the other extra credit, we need to be able to save the list of contacts and load the contacts from file. So that will be the structure of the contacts data source class. So for the solution implementation, we'll start by creating the contact class, adding the 3 attributes and adding the functions. Then we're going to create the contact data source class, and then we're going to add that contact data source as a variable in the table controller and use the data source to provide the table view controller with the needed information. Then we will run the app and test it. And that concludes the overview of iteration number 2. In the next video, we'll implement these steps.